All right, let's talk about acid-base balance. So, going to be a fairly long series, about 15 minutes each section, and this is just kind of an introductory to the concept. So, you could summarize life as basically just chemistry. So, all of life on the planet, but specifically we're going to talk about people, it's just chemical reactions. So, the difference between an inanimate object and a human being at the chemical level is there is a series of chemical reactions that keep happening over and over again, and when those chemical reactions stop happening, you're dead, essentially. Okay? So really, if you wanted to look at the real basic level, when you're dealing with people in medical emergencies, you're trying to keep those chemical reactions happening and make sure that they're happening in the correct environment. It sounds crazy. You're not sitting there thinking about those chemical reactions on these calls, but it's important to have an understanding of those because pretty much any medical emergency, I would go so far as to say every single one, will lead to a disruption of those chemical reactions. So why acid-base balance is directly related to these chemical reactions is you could think of the body as a planet, like Earth, and you could think of everything happening on Earth as a chemical reaction, just for this analogy, okay? So if you were to take all this stuff on Earth and put it on the moon, it would all die because it needs the atmosphere of Earth, right? To be alive. It needs oxygen, all that stuff. So your body is like its own atmosphere. For these chemical reactions to happen, it needs the perfect atmosphere, which is the body. But the atmosphere of the body can change in response to many different stimuli, in particular medical emergencies. So we'll get into that. Talking about chemical reactions. The most important chemical reaction in the body, for pretty much anybody, is cellular respiration. No matter what you do for a living, if it's related to a human being, this is probably what you're thinking about. So what is cellular respiration? It's our body's way of making energy, ATP in particular. And we need ATP or energy to do literally every other process that the body can do. So it's kind of the basics. You have two ways of making energy. One is extremely efficient, one is less efficient. The efficient way of making energy is called aerobic respiration. It's called aerobic because you need oxygen. Okay? Aerobic respiration is great. It starts with glycolysis, and then there's a preparatory reaction. There's the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, you might know it as, and then the electron transport chain. And I'm not going to go into all of that in particular, but the point is that works extremely well. It can be disrupted. Sometimes it's disrupted, but let's just say everything is working absolutely fine. You're going to make a pile of energy, and you're also going to make some water, H2O. Okay, so keep an eye on that hydrogen ion right there. The hydrogen ions are a natural byproduct of cellular respiration. Just keep that in mind. Let's say you don't have any oxygen to your cells, or that your cells need so much energy that even though you're supplying the body with oxygen, it's not enough oxygen for the energy demand. The body can switch to anaerobic cellular respiration, okay? Anaerobic is without oxygen, and it is essentially glycolysis, okay? It's the first part of aerobic respiration, and then the body can't go any further because oxygen is needed for every other part of cellular respiration. So anaerobic respiration is when glucose is essentially turned into lactic acid for a net gain of 2 ATP. So really, it's terrible relative to the entirety of aerobic respiration. It's a much less efficient system. And something that will come into play here in a little bit is it produces lactic acid, which is a particular type of acid called a fixed acid or non-volatile acid. And we'll talk about why that's such a bad thing, especially when you're critically ill. Things to take note. No matter what, the exhaust or byproduct of creating energy will always be some level of acid, okay? So some level of hydrogen ions or a fixed acid, which is even worse. That absolutely is always going to happen when you create energy, and you're always going to be creating energy. Another thing to note would be when we talk about metabolism, Okay, so we hear that word and we kind of have an idea as to what it means, even just with no education whatsoever. But in particular, metabolism, what that means is the speed of the chemical reactions happening in your body, in particular cellular respiration. How quickly is the body going through aerobic respiration? How quickly is the body creating the byproducts, H2O and CO2? That is metabolism. The quicker that it's making it, the higher the metabolism. The slower those reactions, the lower the metabolism. So metabolism is important in understanding cellular respiration, and you'll see it's important in understanding acid-base balance and how that can be affected. You could think of the human body as a machine, and it's just, I've kind of already said it that way, but let's get this concept going. So the idea is the human body is a machine, really it is. It seems like the most amazing machine on the planet until you start going into medical emergencies and you can see how it can actually get right out of control with no way to fix itself in certain situations. But when everything is functioning well, the human body is one of the most amazing machines on the planet because of evolution. You could very simply compare it to a car. Obviously, it's more complicated, but it's pretty similar. A car, like let's just say a Toyota Corolla, let's say you start the car. Well, there is action happening, there's energy being created, right? And let's say you're just sitting in a parking lot, the car's in park, you're not touching the gas, it's burning a certain amount of fuel, and that's reflected in your revolutions per minute, right? So you're burning at, like, let's say 1,000, 1,500 revolutions per minute. You're burning very little fuel, and you're just existing, essentially. Kind of like the human body would just be existing sitting in a chair. You can put work into that engine. You can put more gas into it to create much more energy, and the RPMs will rise. And there will be more exhaust as a result of creating that energy, and there will be more power. The human body is the same with metabolism. So just sitting there with absolutely nothing wrong with you and you're at relatively homeostasis, then you're burning very little glucose, you're creating very little H2O and CO2, and there's not much going on as per byproducts of metabolism. Your metabolism, however, changes on a constant basis. Even something as simple as walking up a flight of stairs will increase metabolism. It will increase the amount of energy needed, and it will therefore increase the rate at which that chemical reaction is happening. Therefore, it will increase the negative byproducts, right? The hydrogen ions, the CO2, and God forbid, lactic acid, okay? That's the way the body works. Whenever you are ill, literally any illness, your metabolism will increase. Really, a fever is to increase your metabolism, to increase your chances of fighting off any illness of any kind. It's part of your body's first response. So your metabolism will be higher. Anybody who's ill, and we'll just use like the flu as an example, and you have a fever, now your body's metabolism is higher. So you could think of that as the Toyota Corolla sitting in the parking lot, but now it has an RPM of 2,000 and 3,000 RPM, just sitting there doing nothing. So the base metabolism is much higher, and they're producing acids at a much higher rate. So that's what you want to kind of keep in mind with the human body. And you'll see as we go through, I'm going to often refer to the human body as a machine because it makes it very easy to understand. So, just some basic stuff we have to go over. You really don't need to know all that much about chemistry to be a paramedic. In fact, you learn almost no chemistry as a paramedic. Even with the plans of going to a 3-year program, there is no chemistry class. Now, it's a prerequisite, like a high school chemistry or something like that. You can get the equivalent at your local college, but you need to know very little. So we're going to talk about very little, as much as you need to know. What is an acid? An acid is anything that releases or donates a hydrogen ion. And to make it even simpler than that, when you see, and I have like a little picture of carbonic acid here, when you see an element, or I should say a molecule, and there's hydrogen ions within that molecule, then it's probably an acid. And the more hydrogen ions, the worse of an acid it is, generally speaking. That's a really simple way to look at it. Acidity in general increases as hydrogen ions increase, okay? The more hydrogen ions in the body, generally speaking, the more acidic you are. we don't want an excess of hydrogen ions. And remember, cellular respiration, no matter what, even if everything was working well, is going to lead to hydrogen ions. It's going to lead to CO2 as well. So that's what an acid is for our purposes. Bases are the complete opposite, and that theme will continue through this entire presentation. Bases are the opposite of acids. Okay, bases absorb or receive hydrogen ions. So there's something that can grab that hydrogen ion, keep it from free floating in the body and increasing the acidity level. And we'll see what bases do for us a little bit more later. You can actually have too much bases. Now, it's rare, but it can happen where the base level is increased too high. That can have the complete opposite effects of too much acid, and we would call that an increase in alkalinity. That's also extremely bad for the body and can cause death, but what you'll see is almost no medical emergencies lead to this state. Some do. It's rare. What's much more common is that metabolism is increased and therefore acids are increased, and at some point it gets to a point where it's extremely bad for the human body. We measure acidity using the pH scale. So that's unanimous. That's just a science thing. Nobody measures it any other way. And it's no different for the human body. If you went to a lab for any reason whatsoever and they did lab work on you, the results are going to be presented to you in pH. Your blood is this pH, okay? So what is pH? Well, it's a logarithmic scale, which means essentially that every movement up the scale, you go up by the power of 10. All you really need to know is that by moving up the scale, there's about a 10 times increase in hydrogen ion concentration or a 10 times decrease in hydrogen ion concentration. To make that even more simple, a movement of this scale is an unbelievable change in the status of the human body. It is crazy. If you move an entire movement on the scale by 1, like from a 7.35 to a 6.35, it is like the body isn't even a human body anymore. That is such a significant change. It's unbelievable, whether up or down. Okay? So that means that by moving 0.01, it's still a very significant change. You don't want to move on the scale at all. Of course we do, and we'll talk about that, but we want to stay at a nice Goldilocks zone, which we'll talk about. So you can move up or down the scale. Okay, so down the scale is acidosis, up the scale is alkalosis, and in a perfect scientific environment, if you could just have distilled water, that would be, or not even distilled water, if you had like a magical substance that was an absolute perfect pH of 7, that would be right in the middle of the scale, so pH 7.00. So to go up, again, is alkalotic, to go down is acidotic. There's no tricks here. That's just a memorization game. You absolutely must memorize the fact that up is alkalotic, down is acidotic. Have to memorize it. Unfortunately, something to keep in mind is when we measure acidity in the respiratory system, up is acidotic and down is alkalotic. But don't worry about that for now. So let's bring this around to the human body. The pH of blood is anywhere between 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, that's an acceptable range. If everything was perfect and you lived in a perfect world, then your pH would be 7.4. But you'll see the human body is never really at homeostasis. It's just a striving point. Okay, so we're usually a little bit right or left of it due to the demands of the body. So let's just give an example of that. If you run up a flight of stairs late for class, that might already be enough to put your body into acidosis. In fact, it definitely is enough, okay? So you run up a flight of stairs. Now, are you going to die? No. I mean, that would be a pretty useless system, wouldn't it? So your body is designed to be able to handle minor variations and bring you back to homeostasis. So you run up a flight of stairs and your pH swings to, let's say, 7.36. So it's below 7.4. So it's relatively, meaning relative to 7.4, it's relatively acidotic. Now, again, it's within that acceptable range. We're okay with that because the body will have absolutely no problem swinging that pendulum back to 7.4. When we leave 7.35 and when we leave 7.45, every single aspect of the function of the body becomes impaired. and it becomes much harder to bring that body back to homeostasis. So if we go back to that planet analogy, 7.35 to 7.45 is Earth. All the chemical reactions that happen here are ideal. They're in an ideal environment. Everything should be okay. You start to leave that zone, it's like leaving the planet. Now you're taking people on the planet and putting them on the moon. It's not going to work. Okay? Now, it doesn't fail immediately, but the further you leave that Goldilocks zone of 7.35 to 7.45, chemical reactions are impaired. It gets to a point where they just don't happen. Okay? So that's a nice way of thinking about it. The further away from there, the worse. So, knowing that, we need to keep you in homeostasis. So we're going to talk about how the body does that in particular. Because again, if you leave it, eventually you'll die. So we have buffer systems, are what they're called, and buffer systems are responsible for maintaining acid-base balance. What are the buffer systems? Just a quick overview, and then we're going to go through all of these in extreme detail, but this is just an overview. So there's the buffer system themselves. So I kind of mentioned hydrogen ions are bad. Your body really doesn't want free-floating hydrogen ions. So there's many different buffer systems available to immediately absorb hydrogen ions. Some of those create an acid and some of those create a base. Okay? So the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system is something we're going to talk about real quick when we talk about respiratory buffering. But those elements are necessary to transport hydrogen ions to the lung, where they can be excreted. And they're also important to transport hydrogen ions to the kidney. So we'll talk about that. So things to take note of right off the bat. The respiratory system is one of the ways that we regulate acid-base balance. What you need to know about the respiratory system is it happens quick. So to go back to that analogy of running up a flight of stairs, what's the first thing you're going to notice when you run up a flight of stairs? Man, I'm short of breath. Even if it only lasts 10 seconds, it probably lasts more, but even if you're in excellent shape, you're going to get that feeling, and you're going to increase the rate and depth of respirations. You're going to exchange more air than usual for a period of time. Why is that happening to you? Is it because you need more oxygen? Actually, probably not. You might need a little bit more, but probably not. What you're really doing is getting rid of acids. And we'll talk about the fact that your respiratory system is really regulated by acid and not oxygen, which you would think it is, but it's not. Then there's a renal system, so your kidneys. Your kidneys are the long-term, long hauler, like we're going to get this figured out no matter what system, okay? So whenever your acid balance is drastically changed, your respiratory system will not be able to carry the load, and you need your renal system to get you right back to homeostasis. It's incredibly efficient, and it can get rid of any type of acid, but the problem is it takes time, like we're talking days of time, okay? But nothing compares to the renal system in terms of getting you back to homeostasis, not even medical intervention. The renal system is really what you need. Some more basic stuff that you just have to memorize. There's no tricks to it, okay? So we already talked about blood being 7.35 to 7.45, which means the ideal pH would be 7.40. Let's say you were at that ideal pH of 7.40. If you were at that ideal pH, you would have a ratio of 20 bases, or 20 salts you could say, but that just means bases, to 1 acid. This is the place the body likes to be, 20 bases to 1 acid. This is exactly where we want to be. The reason we want to be that way is it's called a buffer system for a reason. It's a buffer for whenever some type of insult comes to the body, right? So you become ill, you start to bleed, it doesn't really matter. Even something as simple as the example we gave earlier of running up a flight of stairs, the reason your body can handle that is because it's sitting there with 20 bases to 1 acid. So as soon as your acid increase, it immediately starts to deal with that and get rid of those acids, okay? To go back to the car analogy, the moment the RPMs rise, there's more exhaust coming out to get rid of that exhaust, to get rid of that bad stuff, okay? This body's the same way. So we're set up to immediately handle an acid insult. I did put some blood values there. I would say that as a primary care paramedic, there is little to no use in knowing blood values. Okay, maybe that's a bit controversial. I really don't think it is. There are reasons that colleges teach them, and I agree with those reasons, but to be honest with you, as a working paramedic in Ontario, even at an advanced care level, we don't have blood work. We will almost certainly never have blood work at work. It just doesn't make sense. And if you're doing an interfacility transfer, then you're technically not even responsible for that patient. It's technically the nurse. If they don't send a nurse escort, it's still actually the responsibility of the hospital. So the reason I bring up transfers is it's the only time you would have blood work ever, would be an interfacility transfer where you have it. Having said that, you're going to work for Orange or some type of interfacility transfer service as an ACP or CCP. You need to know everything there is to know about blood values, absolutely. But as a working road paramedic, you don't need to know it. Find out what your college wants you to know and memorize it. I was never a big fan of teaching blood values, and I would say that on an AEMCA setting, they almost never come up. It's more the understanding of this person's an acidosis because of this, that, and the other thing. It would be kind of crazy to say, what is his pH? Something else we'll teach later is how to interpret blood gas volumes, how to interpret blood work, which most colleges teach, not all of them. And we'll go over it because colleges teach them. But again, there's not much actual application as a working paramedic for that. So on the left and right of this slide is the actual blood values of bicarbonate and carbonic acid. So let's kind of sum this back up. We want to be at 7.4. Okay, we already know that. When you go below 7.4, then we consider that to be acidosis. Even if you're not actually outside of that Goldilocks zone, you're still relatively acidotic, right? That's acidosis. To go above 7.4, we consider that alkalosis, okay? Neither is good. One is way more common than the other. We already mentioned that. It's acidosis. You're going to see that 9 times out of 10. That's not an actual statistic, just an analogy. And then no matter what, chemical reactions will be affected by straying from that zone. Let's say your pH drops below 6.80, you should die, technically. Here's another thing you're going to learn about people and human beings. They're dynamic. Every human being is different. And just because the book says that at 6.8 you're dead, doesn't mean you will be dead. I picked up plenty of people who maybe they died later, but they were alive with a pH of 6.3. It sounds insane, and it is certainly insane, but they weren't dead yet, okay? So you can stray around that zone. It depends how young you are, how strong you are, how healthy you were before this insult, blah, 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 blah. There's a million factors, and therefore this is just a general guideline, okay? You could safely say somebody's unstable if their pH is outside of the 7.35 and 7.45 zone. You might be saying, we don't have blood work. I don't understand how we're going to know this. How could we possibly know this? We don't have blood work, but we do have the ability to interpret gases exiting the respiratory system, which are a direct reflection of acidosis. And another thing is, when you learn about medical emergencies, you learn about which ones cause acidosis and which ones don't, and at what phase in the illness the person would likely be acidotic. So there's actually quite a few situations without blood work that we can really safely assume that this patient is in metabolic acidosis. We'll talk about that. So any condition that increases hydrogen ions will cause acidosis. That should probably be clear by now. It is technically possible to cause acidosis by decreasing base bicarbonate, or you could just say by decreasing bases. That's technically possible, far less likely, far less relevant, but it's possible. So what is alkalosis? It's the complete opposite, isn't it? Any condition that increases base bicarbonate, rare, or a decrease in hydrogen ions can cause alkalosis. Both of those are rare. Now, there are certain things that cause them, and we'll talk about it. But again, anything to do with alkalosis is much rarer, and almost everything we're going to be talking about is acidosis. There are 4 different major abnormalities, but I will say that as a paramedic, we generally refer to either respiratory acidosis or metabolic acidosis. We never know for sure somebody's in metabolic acidosis, but like I said earlier, there will be guidelines in place. So, oh, if he has this disease and it has been this amount of time, it is now safe to assume that he is in metabolic acidosis. Respiratory acidosis we can actually measure in the field using EtCO2. You can have mixed abnormalities such as respiratory acidosis and metabolic alkalosis, and that would be really easy to tell with blood work. It's almost impossible to tell outside of a hospital. So once again, the only time we would be aware of that would be a disease that is highly associated with that particular type of abnormality. So then you would say, oh, you have this disease and you have this current problem, and I know that tends to be associated with this. So that would be about the limit of understanding of that. We're going to talk about what causes respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, and metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. We're going to talk about all of that. The respiratory part is especially interesting and important to you as a paramedic because even if the person is not currently experiencing some type of medical emergency that is causing an acid-base imbalance, we can use what we know about acid-base to determine somebody's respiratory function. We'll talk about that. So why do we leave homeostasis? We kind of already mentioned a bunch of that, didn't we? There's a million reasons to leave homeostasis, ranging from running up a flight of stairs to having the flu to being in a car accident where you have one fracture. Anything, any insult to the body at all will require energy and will cause a reaction, sympathetic reaction that will start the metabolism to increase. Your metabolism will increase, and again, to use that car analogy, your RPMs will go higher and the exhaust will be created. With the body, it can get to a point where the RPMs are so high that the exhaust cannot be expelled quick enough and they accumulate. Okay, and that's what we're worried about: accumulation of hydrogen ions or accumulation of fixed acids. Medical emergencies, generally speaking, always lead to an accumulation of hydrogen ions and an accumulation of fixed acids, depending on the medical emergency itself. But if they're not treated, that's ultimately what's going to happen. Now, a lot of that can be traced back to a lack of oxygen, but the point is there's a ton of ways to leave homeostasis. Pretty much when you learn about any injury of any kind, you'll learn about why and how they can. So we'll leave that for the particular injuries. But as we go through the buffer systems in the next few videos, you'll see why we leave homeostasis. So if you find videos like this helpful, subscribe for more, and this series is going to go on for quite a bit. The next thing we're going to go over is respiratory acidosis in particular.